We thought we knew what was going to happen, but the truth of the matter was that slowed us down because we kept on having to go back and say, well, why are these things not working?
You go into a project with pre-existing expectations and then the data doesn't match them. And that whole process of trying to shift your thinking and understand what's happening and recognizing your internal biases and trying to correct them was a very interesting process.
Putting single fission in the context of actual light harvesting is a hard problem.
To start with, we believed that we had isolated triplets, right? We didn't question that they were not isolated triplets, and we were quite confident that they were going to dissociate, and all we had to do was find out which acceptor was going to be the ideal one. So to discover that maybe we didn't have as many separated, uniquely identifiable triplet states, and that they were not dissociating, does hold things up. It means that you have to dig deeper into the data to find out what's going on.
I was really interested in figuring out the fundamental rules of how to dissociate excitons. Where excitons exist in many solid-state materials, but they're not something that people generally think about with inorganics, because in those materials, when you photoexcite them and you promote an electron to a higher energy level, and it leaves behind a positively charged hole, that negative charge and that positive charge can't really see each other, so they immediately fly apart and you get an electrical current. Whereas in organic materials, the exact opposite happens. That negative charge and that positive charge can see each other and they actually stick together. If you think about it from that perspective, it was actually quite a mystery for a long time why these excitons should ever dissociate to begin with and why organic photovoltaics, organic solar cells should work at all. However, they actually do work quite well, and one of the ideas that arose in recent years was how do we use one of the more exotic processes that happen in organic materials to increase the efficiency of solar cells beyond even the limit that's reachable by the current standard materials like silicon. This exotic process, which is called single fission, converts one high energy version of that exciton, that bound electron hole pair, into two lower energy excitons that have a different spin. When we're converting an exciton with a spin of 0 to two excitons with spins of 1, what we really care about is that we're going to two lower energy states, and we want to split both of those apart such that we get two electron hole pairs per photon. So that would be able to double the photocurrent that we'd be getting per photon in that solar cell if we were able to utilize that single fission material.
There have been a few investigations where people have gone to the next step to make single fission devices, so photovoltaic devices. And they've shown that single fission has an influence on devices, but they haven't been able to really track down the microscopic details. And so there's been some concern that the effects seen, either are not real or inflated or too uncertain to really trust.
Is taking a triplet state and dissociating it into charges different from doing the same thing with singlet states? And my bias going into it was that the answer would be no, there's no real difference. And so when the data started coming in and it was clear that something was not working right, it was a real puzzle to figure out what it was and why it wasn't working the same way.
So do these triplets from singlet fission, can we dissociate them and turn them into carriers? Everyone assumes that we can. We need to test that. So the microwave experiment is unique to us almost. There are other groups in the world that can do it, but it's in North America it's relatively unique, and therefore it provided an opportunity for us to look at systems that other people couldn't investigate because their experimental tools are not either sensitive or they're not designed to look for the sort of signals that we were going to look for. So the idea of having low concentration acceptors in a host material, it's easy to do an experiment on that if you say just do a PL quenching experiment, but that doesn't tell you anything about charges being generated, and that's where the microwave experiment is really quite unique in its sensitivity of those charges.
Combining techniques, so using some of our conventional transient absorption techniques and the transient microwave conductivity, putting those together into one kinetic scheme, which normally we have two different ones because they're in different, the excitation regimes are different and sometimes samples are prepared differently, but in this case we try to keep everything consistent. And that ultimately we were able to use basically one kinetic scheme and sort of stitch everything together, and it makes sense instead of having this sort of break in between timescales and saying, well, this happens here and this happens here.
Getting those two data sets to talk to each other is non-trivial.
I did a lot of the simulations for the paper, and well, it took work to put those together and make it happen. Natalie did most of the experiments, so as far as technical challenges of getting the work done, that was hers to deal with.
So one of the parameters that we were really interested in was this parameter called driving force, which is basically how energetically favorable it is to do the reaction, how much the reaction wants to happen. And what was surprising about some of the original predictions about driving force and what eventually became Marcus theory was that as you increase the driving force and you make it more and more favorable to do the reaction, the rate of reaction will increase and it will eventually reach an optimum. What really shocked people was that as you further increase the driving force, that rate will actually start to decrease. And while this has been seen in some cases in photoinduced electron transfer, which is electron transfer after the absorption of light, this had never been explored for triplet states. The way that we control how much driving force is present for a reaction is we choose different molecules that have different electrochemical properties, or to put it more simply, want to accept an electron either more or less. So some molecules really want to accept an electron and some molecules don't want to do it at all. And we want to carefully step through all of these different types of molecules and just slightly change the amount to which that molecule wants to accept an electron. Since the singlet is higher in energy, we want to start with molecules that will be fairly happy with accepting an electron from that singlet state. And you'll see evidence of that free charge generation increasing slowly as you start to give it a little bit more oomph. And you'll see an optimum start to appear for that singlet state. And then that will start to turn over in the way that is predicted by Marcus theory, which is that at some point you'll have too much driving force for that reaction, and actually the rate will start to decrease. And the way that we're measuring that free charge generation, which we're measuring through that microwave conductivity technique, will start to then decrease. Then we want to start using molecules that really want to accept an electron from that triplet state, and then you'll see the free charge generation start to increase again, and you reach a separate optimum for that triplet state. Interestingly, we also see that optimum start to turn over, where the free charge generation decreases again for that triplet state.
It certainly required some synthetic expertise, which is why all of our co-authors were so crucial, Nadia and John Anthony and others.
But there are two data points on that plot that required synthesis beyond our collaborations outside of the lab. And so when Nadia became involved and focused her synthesis efforts with Natalie on getting those two cyano-derivatized perylines, where it's a strange thing to do, because you're saying I want to make the driving force so large that I have a small rate constant for electron transfer and therefore have less charges, which is not what you would intuitively think would be a good thing to strive for, but for that understanding the fundamental mechanism, that's quite critical. So those two molecules were key to convincing us that we had an inverted Marcus region for the triplet state. Very few people have seen the inverted region for photoinduced electron transfer, and this paper has it within the same paper. We have apparently an inverted region for the singlet states and for the triplet states. I don't think there are any other papers out there that would display such clear evidence of the process.
So we not only have this driving force where we can optimize the free charge generation from that triplet state, but we can also see that the rate for singlet dissociation is likely decreasing significantly before that. And this is an unexpected bonus for a singlet fission solar cell, where singlet dissociation is an effective loss process. So if your singlets are dissociating, that means they can't turn into triplets, which then, because there's less excitons, you're not going to get double the current. You're only going to get what you originally would have gotten in a normal solar cell. After I figured out that optimal molecule that wants to accept an electron from that triplet state, just the right amount, so not too much, I then wanted to know what that rate was.
It was a real puzzle to figure out what it was and why it wasn't working the same way. And I feel like it was like a 6-month journey for us to figure out that it was because the process was 5 orders of magnitude slower than we expected it to be. I mean, that may have been one of the biggest challenges, was just shifting our thinking, admitting that it might not be happening the way people had always assumed that it would.
And in a solar cell, you want to make sure that the process you want to happen, which is, in this case, breaking excitons into free charges, you want to make sure that process happens really fast so that the molecules don't have any chance to do anything else and decrease your charge yield and therefore the current that you're actually getting out of the solar cell. So the fact that we found this really slow rate for exciton dissociation, which no one had really even been aware of before, or even known to look for it, because no one had actually optimized all of these other parameters, including driving force, beforehand, the implication for the field is that there's now this big challenge of how do we increase this rate? What is causing this slow rate that's so different from what we saw for singlet states? And it's this problem, and having identified this problem, perhaps in the future we can actually make singlet fission solar cells that are highly efficient every time we sit down to do it.
A follow-up paper.
More papers.
So the next step after this paper, I think, is really to broaden the number of hosts to better understand the reasons for the relatively slow triplet exciton dissociation in these systems. So we don't understand that yet, and I think it could be a really rich area for a fundamental understanding of interexciton interactions, which are very poorly understood at the moment, and it could really make or break whether or not singlet fission is potentially useful.
There's something extra happening. We're still not quite sure what. We know the rate constant for charge transfer is slow, but we're still not sure why that's true. And hopefully it will stimulate people to try and understand why that's the case and get around it somehow.